Welcome. Thank you for joining our Best Practice Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Larry Isaacson, USDM Practice Leader, will be presenting. The discussion today will cover introductions, webinar logistics, and our discussion topic, meeting the challenges facing emerging GxP regulated organizations in the life sciences. The USDM team is proud to have Larry in a leadership role. He offers 20 years in the application of GxP compliant IT technology in life science organizations. Larry has experience in manufacturing, software, development, and clinical and laboratory contract services management environments. He recently led the implementation and validation of an FDA-regulated global ERP laboratory and quality management system. He has experience in establishing IT and quality strategy project and change management programs. Larry has held the position of Director of IT in pharma, biotech, and medical device companies, and he holds an MS in pharmaceutical research sciences. USDM is focused exclusively on the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing quality and regulatory IT compliance professional service solutions. We're headquartered in Ventura, California, and we've delivered over 1,000 successful projects with over 200 life science clients. We offer hands-on experience in assisting clients under regulatory distress, and we are the market leader for validation accelerator packs. Our various dedicated practices include IT and virtualization, quality and auditing, ECM, ERP, PLM, EQM, manufacturing automation and equipment, clinical and drug safety, business intelligence, project management, GRC, and our laboratory practice, which includes both systems and equipment. In addition, we have subject matter experts on board to support compliance in the nutraceutical industry. The content today will be covered in approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll invite you to post questions for our team via the iLink message board. It's on the lower left of your screen, or you can join the discussion on LinkedIn and post any questions there. We're happy to address questions offline as well, and my contact information will be provided at the end of the session. Thanks for joining us, and now I'll turn the presentation over to Larry.
Thanks, Becky. Today's webinar is a little bit of a different flavor than what we usually do. Rather than talk about validating particular systems or a particular specific areas of application and quality, I want to step back and look at what often leads to some of the issues we see at USDM as we come into companies, because they tend to have a common root cause, especially more recently as there are many companies and divisions moving into the regulated space as new products come on board and the regulatory scope widens. So we wanted to cover how you can anticipate and better manage the migration into a regulated operation and save a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of aggravation in the process. So the main topics that we want to address is the compliance maturity challenge. Basically, this is a problem of organizational maturity in different disciplines being applied to the compliance area in GxP that we're addressing. What are the hallmarks of an emerging compliance requirement? How can you see when this is going to become an overwhelming need that you need to get ahead of? What are the key compliance domains to address early as you move into this area, and how to manage the process best? And then we'll have summary and recommendations and action items you can take. So the compliance maturity challenge is a term that's reflecting what we see companies dealing with as they become more cognizant of the GxP challenges they face under various scenarios. And maturity models are well known in the industry, in many industries. in terms of how organizations cope with change in different dimensions of their practice. Capability maturity model integration applies to many domains, as most people are aware, and most significantly in terms of top of mind is software engineering. This is where people talk about it the most, and in terms of IT and how you come up the maturity curve in terms of software development is most well known. However, when you look at this closely, this has evolved into specialized types of maturity models for product development practices, various types of services and governance and corporate governance, and risk management, usually sponsored by various standards bodies that happen to focus on these areas, and as well as enterprise architecture, which has its own maturity model outside of the general software development maturity model, appropriately, in fact. And the same process, the same challenge applies to GxP compliance processes for IT systems as we see it. We work with companies at all stages of this maturity model, and what we see most often, which is most painful, is how little this is understood as companies are moving into this area, and we'd like to address that to give people a heads up. Organizations emerging into compliance, the scenarios are discovery stage organizations migrating to development phases naturally, and then from development migrating into full production, and departments or divisions adopting new systems or integrating newly regulated process. And this we're seeing more and more. So you may have one company which has actually been quite advanced in certain areas of its operation, like ERP, but then in certain other areas, like clinical, it may have done very little in the regulatory space, or an organization just has gotten new business units through acquisitions that were well behind in the maturity model and need to come up to match the rest of the organization. So we look at this very surprisingly as a stovepipe effect, where we see segments of organizations being at very different positions on the maturity model and awareness of what GxP impact is going to do to their operation. And that's what we specialize in, is helping organizations not just get individual projects done, but come up this maturity curve. So the classic maturity model that most people are aware of has to do with these various levels of about 5 levels, and there are variations of this as we'll see. The first being characterized by the fact that their processes are not characterized well. They're unpredictable, poorly controlled, and reactive. And this is often where we first come in after the fact to help clean up projects that were done in this phase. You then move to your managed, where at least the processes are characterized, but you're still in a reactive mode. One project at a time is really rolling its own and often reinventing the wheel. But there may be awareness and there may be a framework of project management within that. When you move up to the defined level, you've actually got a framework in place that addresses compliance. And then you can move into more quantitatively managed, where you're much more refined, and then optimization, where you're actually really at the top of the heap in terms of being efficient and really scaling all of your efforts. That's where you ultimately want to be, but if you can get to level 3, you're way ahead of many organizations in our experience. When you step back from this in terms of what GxP fits in, it's often unclear to us why it becomes sort of the bottom of the heap in terms of priorities in organizations. But when you look at this chart, it gives you a sense of all of the considerations from a compliance and governance perspective a company is dealing with, irrespective of size. Once you've got a product coming to market, all of these factors from strategy all the way to distribution come to the fore. And governance and risk management are just a very small piece. However, managing risk, reducing costs, and driving value are core competencies that need to be involved with all of these areas. And then you've got your partners, along with your corporate, the main entity, that you have to worry about as well. And as we all know, in the supply chain of value and the supply chain of compliance, your partners can put you at risk just as well as you can from your own internal organizations, and especially so not just with contract manufacturing, but with contract IT. And since this is an area that we're focusing on right now in terms of the IT space, we're seeing this partner factor with outsourcing and SaaS and virtualization become more and more of a risk to organizations. So overall, GxP is a small piece of the total universe of considerations when it comes to risk management. IT being over here and risk management being over here, and interestingly, QA is nowhere to be found in here. It has to be baked into each of these. It gives you a sense of why this is often an uphill battle. This chart gives us a better idea within the space of IT compliance of what the maturity model looks like in a little more detail. I like this chart a lot because, especially the heroic efforts, this is where we see people, especially in startups or newly established product development and marketing groups, are focusing. They're designing, they're developing, they're integrating, and they're testing from a pure capabilities and functionality standpoint, but there's very little in terms of quality. And this is where these heroic efforts are very valued to make things happen, but at the same time, there's often a lot of cleanup and waste, and when it comes to compliance, if that's an afterthought, it's extremely inefficient and costly to bake in afterwards. When you start getting to level 2 and you have project management involved, you start actually talking about some people taking the risk of saying we need to write these requirements down ahead of time. We may actually have some project planning and monitoring, and we've got some quality assurance mentioned here. So at least the awareness of quality assurance starts coming into the process, and there's a chance that even though it may be a one-off for each project, you can get ahead of things and have a quality component for validation, let's say, or qualification built in. And up here, you've really got a lot of what you need, especially with validation being explicit. Now, this validation in this particular model may not explicitly be relating to GxP or GAMP type validation, but it is a verification, a formal testing regimen that's being referenced, along with training and formal risk assessments and decision analysis and resolutions. And what you see here as you go through this is you see the GAMP, if you're familiar with GAMP 5, GAMP is really trying to push organizations up this maturity curve. We often find companies that are down here at this level, and by introducing the fundamental GAMP processes, they naturally start raising their awareness to move up towards this level 3. When you move up to level 4, you're obviously past that point where your software quality management has been integrated with your compliance management. And at level 5, you're actually doing causal analysis and resolution. You've got an integrated CAPA process where your CAPA is feeding back into your process standardization, and there are organizations operating at this level that we work with. And what we find is projects that are incorporated with an organization that's at the 4 or 5 level are a lot more efficient, straightforward, and use fewer hours to achieve the same goal than those who are starting down at level number 2, let's say. One of the ways we at USDM look at this overall challenge is within this compliance risk model. And we're focusing on IT here because we focus primarily on the compliance risks and GxP risks that implementation of IT systems brings to an organization. What's interesting is that the idea of implementing an IT system, whether it's ERP or product development or laboratory or CRM for that matter, integrated with other compliance systems, brings with it a host of challenges across the organization. And so when you look at the maturity model, ultimately it translates into this model here of what does it take to achieve regulatory compliance at this pinnacle here. And regulatory compliance is the sum total of alignment from the bottom of this compliant administrative and operations procedures through how the personnel are managed and how the personnel are in turn managing infrastructure, applications implementations, and business processes that are being dependent upon and facilitated by these applications more and more, not just within an organization but across organizations. So while we say administrative and operations procedures are at the bottom of this, are the foundation of all of this, we're specifying compliance organization administrative procedures. They're very different in that the forethought and the management that needs to go into actually having these be compliant to achieve this at the top is considerable. And to us, the ultimate expression of that maturity model is the fact that you are baking this in at the bottom as you go about deciding how you're going to do things as well as what you're going to do and their priorities, which then are driven up through this model to achieve regulatory compliance. Any one of these being the weak link can threaten your overall regulatory compliance, some more closely than others, very closely to what your GAMP risk prioritization model and risk assessments that we do all the time reflect. So why is this challenging for merger organizations? This is not rocket science in many ways. It's not new. Why do we see this as we go into many, many companies across the country and internationally struggle with this as they start emerging into regulatory spaces? Well, these smaller and newer organizations often are migrating into new functions that they haven't done before. As they move through the phases from development or R&D into production and distribution, there's a lot of trial and error going on. Often we see people reinventing the wheel. They're not looking outside. It's not been part of the culture of the company to do that. So they aren't looking for help, and they're basically rolling their own each time. And so this is something they have to move away from to be able to have repeatable processes. There's a cultural aversion to formal processes that we find in these organizations. It's a waste of time to actually document things from many perspectives and to have meetings and things of that nature. There's a lack of separation of duties naturally, where actual wearing many hats is considered a badge of honor. The more you have, the better. And of course, that does increase efficiency, but it also yields very little oversight. And while that's strength in small organizations and startups, it becomes a weakness as you start moving into a regulated situation, as everyone here knows. The first thing that the standards, the GMP standards and the GAMP standards talk about is organizations and separation of duties and distinct quality functions for very good reason. Without that type of separation, it's very difficult to actually define a process and monitor it and understand and measure it in any way. There's no visibility, there's no transparency. So an organization of this nature is focused on the outcomes, not repeatable processes, we said. So they're very leery, and when we go into situations where we're helping a company adapt their current processes to a GxP framework, there's a lot of shock as to how they need to look elsewhere other than just the outcome and look at their process and sort of examine their navel a little bit and determine how they get from A to B. So these represent a tide of resistance against initiatives to introduce compliance-aware culture. And that's what we're talking about here today, is a culture of people that are aware of the compliance challenges, and so that it's not looked at as an afterthought and an annoyance, but it actually becomes part of the job. When you can get to that point, you can save a lot of money and time and aggravation and embarrassment, as we've seen, when things have not been done right and things become audit findings. So the critical success factors that we've seen and we've facilitated as we've come in to help organizations like this is the recognition that they need to adapt to this process of system validation, whether that be infrastructure, applications, interfaces, dealing with partners. There's a whole different mindset that's involved in approaching the project to do this successfully and do it right the first time or move to that ability to do that. There's an organizational structure component. So you can't keep doing things in the same way with the same roles and achieve different results, as we know. And so this adaptation includes an organizational structure adjustment, or at least a role adjustment, and authorities that allow you to create a structure that's defined as you move into projects, from your project management and your system development methodology to, of course, some kind of oversight from a quality organization. The basic acceptance and ownership of a formal procedure is a novel idea to many of these organizations. Having been an IT practitioner for a long time in this area myself, in quality and compliance space, I'm sort of shocked to see how many IT organizations of fairly sophisticated companies are running without procedures or work instructions or any type of regular process of reviewing them, just as a standard part of good IT practice. So it's often very difficult to come in and start talking about GxP compliance in IT when there's very little to work with and you're starting from scratch when it comes to fundamental IT processes. So just getting people to accept the idea that they need to have a procedure that describes what they do, and there's some ownership of that, and there's some management associated with it. There's no usually resources available for that. It's a new concept. And along with that comes the formal testing processes. That's even more challenging, where people have done a programmer does a test, throws it over the wall, and the user basically does the beta test in production. This is not really conducive to a regulated environment. Along with that, we need the structured communications and coordination mechanisms, at least some acceptance of a regular meeting process, some decision-making process that's structured with appropriate sign-offs. That is also very challenging. And as I said before, IT maturity is, I often find, one of the biggest challenges. We may find an organization like manufacturing and distribution well ahead because they've been dealing with this already for regulated divisions or products and are used to having change control and some type of documentation associated with it. But IT often lags behind, or portions of IT lag behind. The ERP group may already be up the curve, but when it comes to the laboratory group, that's lagged behind. Maybe they've outsourced all of their work and now they're bringing that in. So they're going from more of a development and research to more of a QC role. It's a very different mindset. And typically what you ultimately need is a champion of quality and change. This can't happen exclusively from the outside. Someone finally has to stand up and say, look, this is something that has to be given priority. Hopefully that's someone from the top. Unfortunately, when we see these things coming to the fore is usually after a very negative audit finding, which raises things up in terms of priority and aggravation and people's heads rolling and such that it becomes a priority enough to allocate resources to. And what we're trying to do here is avoid that scenario for our clients and future customers. So if you look at these critical success factors and the levels that we've talked about in the maturity model, they break out specifically for a GxP type of compliance consideration into these high-level considerations. If you look at computer system validation capabilities, level 1 to 2, they're often non-existent, ad hoc at best, and they change per project. At the level 3 to 4, they're defined. You do have them, but they're pretty rigid. They may be applying the same model to every project, small and large. Often you may see different ones for each business unit or even for each project, depending on what division it's in. Level 5 moves to electronic signatures, electronic workflows, so using well-established packages, and very most importantly, a risk-based process that recognizes the need to scale your validation and qualification efforts to the risk that's inherent in the nature of the system that you're putting in. When it comes to having a quality organization, a dedicated organization that has the knowledge and the capabilities to help with this internally, sometimes they're non-existent in a level 1 organization or their contract. And it's often has very little insight to what's going on and is brought in at the end. Level 2 is better, but there may be many. As a result of mergers, we often deal with companies that have multiple divisions where the QA has not been reconciled or harmonized, and you're dealing with different standards, and when you deal with global systems, it becomes very complicated. And level 5, in the ideal world, and there's very few ideal ones out there really, you've got a centralized QA function with standards that are well applied across the organization that are, again, scaled to risk. From an IT organization standpoint, this often can be the Achilles heel in our experience. The ad hoc nature that often exists in IT organizations, even of fairly mature companies, or the lack of awareness of GxP compliance in general, and the lack of interest, by the way, as well as the technology-oriented versus business-oriented cultures, and highly software engineering-oriented, tends to push back against this level of compliant management. As you move more into a structured system development methodology, and you've come up to level 2 or 3 on that scale, you've got the opportunity to build in compliance, but usually it's focused on the application layer. This is something where people can grudgingly accept that, yeah, maybe we do have to test these applications formally. They're pretty important, and we do understand what structured testing is there. But when it comes to the underlying infrastructure, that's still a no man's land in many cases, where anything goes, and you just keep things running and don't ask too many questions. We have been in situations where people have had major data center failures where the fundamentals weren't being done on major companies, to finally bring awareness to the fact that they need structure in these operations. And then you've got your risk-based processes again in terms of addressing how they take projects on, how they develop projects in the level 5 areas. You've got baked-in compliance where it's part of the SOPs, and it's dealing with applications and infrastructure. And as we saw before, if your infrastructure is not qualified and controlled, your applications inherit the failure, the shortcomings of the infrastructure in terms of their validated state. Not to say that we don't often come in and turn a blind eye to infrastructure in the interest of getting the application validated, thinking that perhaps the black box approach to infrastructure will work, but as we all know, that's not acceptable in the long run. And infrastructure can be the Achilles heel of application robustness, availability, and integrity, especially if we're talking about database infrastructures and how those are managed as an example, one example. When you're talking about documentation and procedures and training, which are all linked together, they can go from non-existent in level 1 to being at least formalized in level 3. At least they exist, but they're probably not comprehensive. They may only be being done for the largest projects, but the small projects get overlooked. The same with change management, if you want to add that to the mix. That's often the case where there's technical change management, but not GxP type change management. And then at level 5, that's all become electronic, and you've got integrated training, really tracking document release, training before people are allowed to onto systems, when systems are being upgraded or introduced. That's the highest level of management you'd like to get to. But the key is to get from level 1 to level 3 in our view, because that's where the sweet spot is to avoid issues with compliance. Approval authority, this is an area where we really see people hamstringing themselves. To the extent that there is approvals defined, they're usually department-oriented, where IT is governing itself and it signs off on its work, and the users often are secondary in that process. And then it can then become cross-functional, but it's sort of rigid. We've seen people hold up entire projects because one executive is snorkeling in Barbados and can't be found for a week. There's no delegation of possible. That becomes a real issue. And then luckily, if you're very lucky, you've got flexibility with delegation and clarity as to approval authorities. Communication, the same issues. Ad hoc to formal committees and some virtual reviews in the middle, to electronically based and risk adjusted. So you may not have to have everybody signing off if this is a smaller project, a lower risk project, versus a large cross-functional global project. And the quality system tools. This is something where we see companies usually going through 3 evolutions to get where they want to be. They go from non-existent to fragmentary EQMS systems. Somebody went out and bought a document control system. Somebody went out and bought a CAPA system. Someone's using Access to deal with change control. And then they discover that this gets them in trouble. And then there's a manual portion as well. And then they discover that this is not manageable, and they move to an EQMS suite, which is what we recommend. Obviously, if you go with best of breed, you have to do the integration yourself, and you're often having manual handoffs. Even though the various systems exist out there, each have their strengths and weaknesses, we recommend ultimately an EQMS suite with everything from the documents to the training to the CAPA management to the audit management being handled within one suite, so you have an integrated view into that for use in audits as well as your overall quality management. So, what approach should you take to compliance as you're moving into this area? Recognizing the emerging compliance requirements we talked about. Often it starts with an audit finding or and a point solution for one project where something becomes extremely visible. You rush a tiger team in to take care of it. You may get someone like USDM to help you out. And then the opportunity is there to raise awareness that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and find a champion that can then make this visibility from a negative into a positive and say, gee, we can get ahead of this and avoid all of this in the future, and not just that, but save money in the process. I have to tell you very honestly that when I've seen IT organizations incorporate this into their practice, along with user organizations, the level of satisfaction with implementations of systems goes way up because they've met the challenges of GxP validation, and they really have wrung out all of the usually overlooked issues and missed requirements. Establish a quality authority as early as possible, whether that be internal or outsourced. We work with companies who use USDM as their quality authority, since they don't have that many validated applications all through the year, so they can use us on a point basis. That works for some companies. Have a cross-functional team to address GxP compliance needs. It's not just IT's responsibility. It's not just the business responsibility. It's not just quality's responsibility, although they may have to be the champion. Education is the key. Just reading the regulations can often be an eye-opener for most people. When we finally show people the GAMP standards, when we get them to walk through them on the GMP regulations, when we talk explicitly in some of our classes that we give about what these regulations translate into in terms of IT practice or business practice or change control practice, people are much more aware after that, and they understand, okay, how this fits together, as opposed to just resisting it on its principles. Develop a roadmap. When you get past these initial stages, you can develop a roadmap and decide where your high priorities that you need to move into this area sooner rather than later, and then you can phase it in. Getting IT and QA involved at the inception of this is critical, and really think about your cultural barriers and change management. Who is resisting this the most that you need to get into the boat? How can you do it? There are very many ways to do this, and we can help with that. We've done this in many organizations. But it starts with awareness and training. So as we move towards the end of this, I just wanted to summarize some approaches and pitfalls that you can avoid. As you decide to pick up a methodology, there's a lot of off-the-shelf stuff out there. You don't have to adapt. You don't have to roll your own. Use GAMP5 as the foundation. It can be scaled to your specific needs. It's accepted by FDA and any auditor that walks in the door in this area. There are a lot of standard templates, and we can help provide those for you to get a quick start. And there are some companies we're working with that are using newfangled, flexible approaches that have their own sort of self-justifications. We would tend to want to recommend you avoid those. The key to you, if you're going to go through an audit, is someone walking in and saying, gee, I recognize this approach. This is what everybody else is doing. I like that. If it's something completely new with different terminology, you're taking a risk, and you have to educate the auditor on why this is equivalent to what they've seen elsewhere. That's generally something you want to avoid. Reconcile competing quality systems. First, recognize they exist across your organization. If you're trying to start systems across organizations or boundaries, and you've got multiple quality systems, early on, have that discussion about how are we going to get this through quality, what can be accepted by each group. Try to simplify the review and approval process. You've got to be pragmatic about it in terms of how rigid you are about document templates and their approvals, who can sign, who can be an alternate. It needs to be documented as to how you're going to operate. But all of this needs to be well defined, and you try to simplify it, and we can help give you guidance on that because there are some do's and don'ts. But we often come into organizations that have tied themselves up in knots, being strict instructionists on the regulations or the worst case scenarios applied to everything. It's really not necessary. Establish cross-functional groups early. Centralized change control meeting often solves a lot of problems up front, where people get to communicate in a way that, whether it's virtual or otherwise, having a formal, regular get-together of the key stakeholders when it comes to big or critical or fast-moving systems that are regulated will save you a lot of problems later. Educate IT on best practice GxP IT compliance early. This is often the weak link in our experience, and making them aware, getting them up to the same level of awareness of compliance as the rest of the organization, getting them to recognize that their servers, their hardware, their networks, their applications, and their middleware is essentially equivalent, if it's serving a manufacturing organization, as a manufacturing piece of equipment. It's basically being treated the same way once you determine that it's in scope for a regulated system. You've got to look at that as regulated equipment and processes associated with its training. It all comes together. And if you outsource that, they inherit that at consideration as well. Assess SOP impacts early. Now, this is a pet peeve of mine, where I've been in many projects where people leave SOPs till last. Despite many, many attempts to get people to start looking at their SOPs, to get SOPs done if they don't exist, and to get copies of them if they do exist. And even though they're old, even though they haven't been updated, this is one of the most important parts of a validation project. And we've seen many situations where basically the late assessment of SOPs unwinds a lot of effort that's been done to validation, because then the users are coming, or IT is coming and saying, gee, we forgot this. What are we going to do about that? We forgot that this happens, or we didn't know that. Or we have all these SOPs to update we didn't realize. And so getting ahead of that is very, very valuable. And don't underestimate risk of moving to a SaaS, software as a service architecture, or outsourcing your applications or hosting. Often this is the idea of IT, or maybe the idea of a business to save money, but get IT and compliance involved early to assess this, and the vendors from the very beginning, because we've been part of helping companies unwind these arrangements when they've discovered they've gotten themselves into hot water with organizations that weren't properly positioned to support your compliance needs. And don't forget, this is the life cycle that ultimately will be used as the standard by which you are judged when an auditor comes in on a validated system. Has this been done? Is there a set of requirements? If appropriate, was there a design? Was there testing of some kind? Was there formal testing in terms of IQ, OQ, PQ as appropriate for the risk of the project? And are you doing maintenance? And if you retire a system, are you retiring it in a structured way if it's a regulated system? Where did the data go? Are you worried about record retention and things of that nature? So this is a big challenge that ultimately applies to all these regulated systems. And again, there's a risk adjustment. Is very, very important. You can save a lot of money and time by assessing the risk up front, understanding what's happening from the requirements, and then you can scale your testing appropriately and your sign-offs to make things go a lot smoother for everyone. So if you're just moving into this space, or part of your organization is, or a system that wasn't regulated or controlled before is moving into this space, you're still dealing with the first level of competence, because the people involved with the system have not been dealing with this before. If you don't anticipate the speed and scope of compliance mandate in terms of how quickly you're starting to move into this area, you can end up with a legacy of poorly documented, non-compliant applications that need to be remediated later, or will get called out in an audit finding. which often brings somebody like USDM in to help mitigate that. And we don't mind doing that because often what's fun about it is we help people avoid it again in the future and they can understand the root cause. But our goal is really to help you avoid this at the beginning. Lack of a clear QA authority and the standards associated with it are the biggest source of issues, because without that, IT often doesn't have any idea what it's expected to do. You've got to have somebody out there saying, this is the standard against which we're going to be measured. Early education is key, and this is where we can help you along with targeted training and project execution. We have ready-made templates for both business and IT, requirements and testing and SOPs, and we've got proven risk-based methodologies for all the different scenarios that we talked about. Well, thanks again for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Larry. Do appreciate you sharing that very solid information. As he mentioned, we will open the floor to questions now. And while you're typing in your questions, I'd like to let you know that this webinar has been recorded. It will be available on our website, which is, of course, usdatamanagement.com. Okay, let's see. Our first question is from Brian. He's asking which function or department is the best candidate to be the champion of quality in the early stages of the maturity curve?
Well, it varies, of course, which is the answer depending upon your scenario. It often has to be a quality authority, in my experience, or it can be IT or the business. But usually there's got to be for change to happen, there's got to be a bit of a burning platform and there's got to be a carrot. And the burning platform is usually the result of an audit. It may be an audit that came in through the business side, regulatory audit, or it may have come in through a SOX audit or a compliance audit that was brought in by regulatory affairs or QA. The organization that was sponsoring the audit and has the negative findings is usually the logical one to become the champion, to say this needs to be mitigated, and then it's the responsibility of the departments that were called out to be able to adapt this and then help move it forward. But the establishment of a quality authority and somebody responsible for it is most important to be able to have a hub for the wheel. We have other charts that show how the quality mechanism is really works. And the quality group is the hub of the wheel, and the quality system is the vehicle through which you demonstrate compliance. And of course, there are portions of that exist in the business and the IT departments, but a substantial portion, the hub of it, exists in the quality department.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Larry. Our next question, let's see, Janice is asking, how can we justify the investment required in time to take action before the need is critical?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's the most difficult challenge. If you can determine that there is an emerging compliant requirement, anticipating the fact that you're now going to file, let's say, an IND, or you're moving into the process of doing an NDA. It's very, very clear, looking at the regulations, what you're going to be expected to do and the kinds of audits that you'll go through. So the best thing is to be able to use experience from outside the organization to demonstrate that this is something that others have been subjected to. And often what we have used here at USDM is the letters that you'll find on FDA.gov of compliance letters, action letters from the FDA and 483s for the various stages of activities that you may be in. You can find examples from the FDA of companies being cited for all sorts of things. And I've seen that being a very effective motivator for companies to raise their awareness. Whether that's successful doing it before that event happens at your location depends on the nature of the organization. But that's one of the tools you can use to say, gee, this looks like this is happening. Once a project plan is laid out or a product development plan is out there, it's fair to raise the question as to do we need to be aware of this issue? And here's some examples where other companies have been affected. The other is getting examples of case studies from companies like ours that we can cite to give very solid examples of the money you can save and the time you can save and where this activity fits in. And we can have examples of where it's unmanaged versus managed and the effect on your timeline or time to market in that case. So there has to be a formal justification or initiative, but there's multiple pieces to that can be used.
Right. Okay, thank you. Very good. Okay, so we have a question from Satendra. Let's see. How do you manage change in short-term assignments with immature stage 1 to 2 organizations?
Oh, for short-term assignments versus longer-term assignments. This is a management function, of course, and awareness of change is something that has to come with the territory from the standpoint of who's in charge of the project. Now, if you look at traditional SDLC and project management methodologies, they all have a component of change management baked into them, where you're looking at roles and you're basically trying to assess, well, what is this new system, or what is this change in process going to do to people's job descriptions and what's going to have to happen. And part of that is the compliance side. So it starts, again, with awareness. Someone has to become aware of the fact that this is an issue. And this is where we, attending webinars such as this, by the way, for free, we have a whole library of webinars out there on our website that you can look at, such as this one, that describe in great detail the considerations in a whole variety of scenarios that you would have to address. So it's a matter of becoming aware of what's out there on multiple websites, especially as well as the FDA. Some of the software vendor websites have quite a bit out there on what to deal with, but it becomes a bigger challenge in a smaller organization at stage 1 and 2, where they're trying to overcome the inertia of not wanting to stop for a minute to address, to look at themselves in the mirror. Someone has to stand up and be brave enough to say, I'm going to do this for my activity. And often, it starts at home. It starts in your own backyard. So if you're an IT manager or you're a QA manager, you've got the opportunity to say, at least for my own function, where does this fit in, and how might it affect other people or groups?
Well said, Larry. Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question, and this one is from Raghu. If we were to ask USDM to help us justify this type of initiative, how would you go about it?
Well, it's fairly straightforward. Initially, we do an assessment, which doesn't take a long time, of what your current state is. Looking at your current documents, the projects that you have currently underway, your organizational structure, asking a few questions for a couple of hours gives us a very good sense of what you've been dealing with and where you're positioned. And the first thing often that's on the menu is a set of courses. We have a whole series of courses off the shelf that for both business and for IT executives and middle management, making them aware of actionable IT compliance and system compliance, business compliance frameworks for the regulations that apply to them. So depending on the predicate rule in terms of whether a device manufacturer, a drug manufacturer, a nutraceutical organization, we tailor the course to your specific regulatory mandate and what it's going to mean for you to manage projects, whether they be IT projects or business projects, manufacturing initiatives, equipment qualifications, etc. How to go about that and what it's going to mean for your roles. So we can very quickly bring an organization up to speed on what's the standard, quote unquote, for other organizations to deal with this and pass audits and get positive results right from the start in terms of maintaining quality in their operation. Once that awareness is achieved with, let's say, just one day of training, depending on the size of the group, 1 or 2 days, you're really well positioned. You also have an assessment made of what the gaps are. You may not have a training program. You may not have any kind of document control. You may have change control, but it doesn't incorporate compliance considerations. So we can outline a specific plan in the short term to say, okay, here's the holes we need to plug, and then here's the ways we can plug them. We already have solutions for you. And what it might require on your side is to designate people with authority and set aside time and create a few forums so that you can actually manage this new system of governance for your project or your development or for your change control. And usually you get those few things in place and you're 70% there to where you need to be to avoid most of the big pitfalls.
Very good. Very good. All right. Thank you, Larry. As a reminder, I'd like to let everyone know that this session has been recorded and will be available on our website. I'd like to encourage you to visit the USDM website to review the upcoming webinar events as well as the recorded sessions of previously presented topics. As Larry mentioned, there's a wealth of information there, and we are happy to share that. Our next scheduled presentation is titled Automating Electronic Device History Records to Meet Overall Business Objectives for the Life Sciences. And the date for that is November 15. Please join us at 11 o'clock Pacific time. We would also invite you to join the discussion forum on LinkedIn. You can continue asking questions there. We appreciate and welcome your insight, any feedback, and certainly suggestions for future topics. Let us know what pain points you're facing, and if there's a way we can work that into a presentation that we could help you down the road to compliance, we're glad to do that. If you appreciated today's webinar, please let us know by clicking the like button on the USDM LinkedIn group page, or post a comment. It takes just a moment and certainly lets us know that we are on the right track. Thank you, Larry, again for presenting today, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us. We appreciate the opportunity to team with you in working towards excellence and compliance. Have a wonderful day.